Chapter 7 is upon us. Welcome, I'm Sean Kelly and this is my channel on everything real estate. I remember this chapter specifically from class a long time ago, and I remember it being a pretty long one, so I'm going to cut this intro short. You already know to subscribe, you already know to hit that thumbs up button. So let's dive in now, let's pass this North Carolina real estate exam. This is chapter 7, which is all about brokerage relationships. Agency is a fiduciary relationship. It's a position of trust and confidence for someone else above all others, even your own interest. As an agent, you are working on someone else's behalf. However, when a client signs an agency agreement, they're actually signing that agreement with the firm itself, not necessarily you, the agent. The firm is the one that gets the commission and then they split the check off to you.
It's bigger than you expected? What is it?
It's a 1-year membership in the Jelly of the Month Club.
Oh, God.
Now, not all states practice agency, but North Carolina does. So there are 3 different classifications when describing agency, and you'll need to know all 3 because there will be a test question on this. You have the universal agent, you have a general agent, and then you have a special agent. The universal agent is the most broad and powerful of the 3. You basically have unlimited power, and anything you can do, I can do. A general agent is someone who can perform specific activities, so there's still limited power there and there's still limited rules. A good example would be a property manager. They can make some decisions on their own. Then there is the special agent, which is us, the realtors. We have limited acts and very detailed instructions, so we work on the behalf of the client and we're basically professional advisors. So how does an agency relationship start? So it can start when you begin negotiating on the behalf of another person. Additionally, once you begin getting confidential information about somebody and start having conversations about someone's personal info, that's another starter. You don't necessarily need to get paid or have a written agreement to get an agency relationship started, except for in North Carolina, which we'll discuss. For starting an agency relationship here in North Carolina, you must have mutual consent with the client, as well as having a written agreement. Then there's also expressed agency and implied agency. Expressed agency is just 2 people coming to terms with an agreement. Implied is when you take action on the behalf of the client. Imagine going through the entire purchasing process, showing a client 40 different houses just to get to closing without you having an actual written agreement. It's implied that you are their agent at this point. However, this is something you'll need to know for the state portion of the test. In North Carolina, even with implied agency, you still must have it in writing. You still must have a written agreement on both the buying and the selling side. And compensation is never a determining factor on starting agency relationships. Now let's talk about the difference between a client and a customer. So a client is someone we have fiduciary duties to, and a customer is just other people within the transaction. So take a second to think about who a client might be in a transaction, and usually there's only 1 or 2. And then think about who might be a customer within a transaction. There's usually several. A client would actually just be your buyer or your seller, whoever it is that you are representing. And a customer are people like your lenders, appraisals, inspectors, and all these other people within the transaction, including the other person sitting on the other side of the table. If you're representing the buyer, the seller is still your customer, but not necessarily your client. They're not your client. An easy way to remember this, a client is someone you work for, while a customer is someone you work with. So I mentioned fiduciary duties a couple of times now, so let's dive into what that actually is. There's a handy little acronym for it, old car. So you have obedience, you have loyalty, disclosure, confidential, accounting, and reasonable skill and care. So obedience, you should follow all of the requests of your client to an extent, and as long as they're legal requests. So loyalty, you must protect your client's interest above anyone else's, including your own. So disclosure, which we went over a bunch in the last chapter, you must disclose all of the offers, any material facts, and other points of interest. So confidentiality, you must keep all of your client's information and motivations private. Accounting, you must keep track of all of the money and document it. So reasonable care, don't be negligent and don't make statements that you are not knowledgeable about. So a good example here is don't take up somebody on a commercial real estate deal if you've never done a real estate transaction before and if you don't feel confident and knowledgeable within that field. For agency disclosure, there's actually this little brochure called Working with Real Estate Agents that you must actually hand to every person you talk to that's a first substantial contact when dealing with real estate, that is. Now this may be the strangest rule I've ever heard of, so don't be alarmed if you feel the same way. So the brochure discusses agency choices, and you're gonna wanna try to get this in front of your potential client as soon as the first substantial contact happens, and have them sign this back page if possible. They don't need to sign it, but you'll have to notate that. What is first substantial contact? Let me read it off. This is when the customer provides personal, financial, confidential, motivational, wants, needs, or desires, and so pretty much anything related to real estate. Basically, as soon as someone starts opening their mouth and talking, you shush them, you hand in this brochure, you discuss the brochure, and then you move on and continue talking. It's absolutely odd. If you are not speaking with somebody in person, so if you're doing it through text or through a phone call, you'll still need to email or mail this to them within 3 calendar days. Now let's go over the types of agency relationships, which is partly why this is somewhat important. There is single agency, there's dual agency, there's designated dual agency, and then there's no agency. Single agency is when an agent sits on only one side of the transaction, either the buyer side or the seller side. Dual agency is when one broker works both sides of a transaction and represents both the buyer and the seller. Now remember, both the buyer and the seller must provide their consent for you to do so. Designated dual agency is when 2 brokers are working within the same firm, but one is representing the buyer side and one is representing the seller side. This creates way better representation for both the clients and keeps some of the confidential information apart. This also requires consent from both parties. There are several limitations when it comes to dual agency, and this is why many agents choose not to represent both sides. As a dual agent, you can't negotiate pricing for either side because you owe both clients fiduciary duties. You basically just become the delivery person within the transaction, and you hand over the contract to one person, you hand over the counter offer to the other, and then you just kind of hand things back and forth, but you can't negotiate again for either party. You can't show any favorites. You just have to keep your mouth shut and just hand things back and forth. So it's a strange situation to be in. Now for designated dual agency, they can negotiate prices because again, it's 2 separate agents and you have to keep your confidentiality to yourselves. Obviously, you're gonna see people passing by you in the office, but you have to keep that conversation about that particular deal separate. In designated dual agency, a broker in charge and a provisional broker can never be designated dual agents. Why? Because the broker in charge is the supervisor over the provisional broker, so that wouldn't really be fair to the client. Now we talked a lot about our responsibilities, but what about our client's responsibilities? So a client should act in good faith and they should pay you what they had agreed to pay, as well as if a client tells you some bad information and they know it's bad and you get in trouble, they can also possibly be held accountable as well. So now what terminates an agency relationship? Well, the duties could be complete. You know, the offer goes through, it's sold, you're done. There could be a breach in contract. The agreement could expire. The property itself can be destroyed, or there could be a mutual agreement. You no longer want to work with each other, or the client can pass away. Now, if you as the agent pass away, there's still an agreement there because remember, that agreement is between the client and the firm, not necessarily the client and the agent. Now let's go over material facts. So North Carolina is a caveat emptor state, meaning buyer beware. However, it is still up to the agent to disclose material facts. A material fact is everything you do know and everything you should know. This includes defects or facts based around developments or changes around the property and many other points of interest. The agent does not fill out the disclosure form. This is placed 100% on the seller. However, a seller can decide to mark no representation and not disclose anything. When you do see a listing that says sold as is, this does not mean the licensee is not held accountable for anything that they do not disclose. You still must disclose any of the defects. Another disclosure form you'll want to acquire is the mineral oil and gas disclosure. This will disclose any information on who owns the mineral rights and subsurface rights. Now let's go over some prohibited conduct. For disclosures, there are 4 different classifications of misconduct for an agent. There is willful misrepresentation, then there is negligent misrepresentation, then there is willful omission, and then negligent omission. So rather than try to memorize these, try to understand these. So what does willful mean? Willful means you are willing, which means you are lying and you are willing to lie. Now what does negligent means? It means you thought something was true, but it wasn't. It was a mistake. Then misrepresentation means you stated something as fact even though it was untrue. While omission means you just left it out, means you didn't even mention it. With this logic, willful misrepresentation would be the worst misconduct. Now why? Because you willingly and knowingly stated an incorrect fact. The most harmless ones are the negligent ones because you actually thought something was true and it just turned out that it wasn't. There was an honest mistake. A key word to know here is puffing, and puffing is allowed in real estate and when listing a property. It's a broad statement about a property and typically something descriptive like beautiful home, wonderful living, great neighborhood, things like that. The things you don't need to disclose about a property are things like the death or illness of a property owner, the proximity to sex offenders, or whether the house is haunted or not. Next, let's talk about licensee or broker-owned houses. A licensee can never sell their house and also represent the buyer on the other end. This is common sense and would obviously be unfair to the buyer. In general, as a realtor, you are held to a higher standard when selling some of your own properties. You must also disclose all interest and ownership in properties before a transaction. Oh my gosh, so that went way faster than the 2 to 3 days I remember spending in class on chapter 7. I'm serious, we are done. We just have a review to do. There's not even time for a midterm. We are good. Although maybe now I've just seen this stuff so many times that it just seems easy and quick. So just remember, you'll get there in no time. Let's get to the review. When a client signs an agency agreement, they're signing an agreement with the firm, not necessarily the agent. Agency is working on someone else's behalf. Our firm is working on the behalf of the client. Universal agents have the most power. General agents have limited power, things like property managers, and special agents are people like us, realtors. Basically no power, and we're basically professional advisors. An agency starts in North Carolina when there is mutual consent and it is in writing. Clients are the people we work for, while customers are the people we work with. Fiduciary duties are the foundation of professionalism and go with the acronym OLD CAR. That is obedience, loyalty, disclosure, confidential, accounting, and reasonable skill and care. You must disclose, discuss, and decide when it comes to this working with real estate's brochure at the very first substantial contact with your potential client. So there are agency choices. There's single agency, dual agency, designated dual agency, and no agency. Single agency is when one agent is working on the selling side and a different agent in a different firm is working on the buying side and representing the other person in the transaction. Then dual agency is when one agent is working both the buying side and the selling side and can't negotiate on anyone's behalf, is basically just an errand boy running contracts and counteroffers back and forth. Then there is designated dual agency, where two agents are still working within the same firm, but one agent is working on the buying side, one agent is working on the selling side, and all of the confidentiality must be kept secret and held to both sides. Then no agency obviously is a client not wanting to be represented at all. And remember, a broker in charge and a provisional broker can never be designated dual agents at the same time. A broker in charge supervises the provisional broker, and it just wouldn't be fair. So an agency relationship can be terminated if the duties are complete, if the agreement has been expired, if there has been a mutual agreement, if there has been a breach in contract, if the property has been destroyed, or if the client themselves pass away. Remember, if you as an agent pass away, there's still an agreement between the client and the firm. Material facts always must be disclosed and are everything you do know and everything you should know. A seller does not have to disclose anything. They can mark no representation on the disclosure form. However, this would set off a huge red flag to any potential buyer. Like, why aren't they representing anything? Why aren't they disclosing any of these defects? They might be hiding something. The mineral oil and gas disclosure shows who owns those subsurface and mineral rights. Willful misrepresentation is the worst type of misconduct. Negligent misrepresentation, willful omission, and negligent omission are the other 3 types of misconduct. Death or illness, proximity to a sex offender, or whether a house is haunted or not are things that do not need to be disclosed. And an agent cannot represent a buyer when selling their own home. And that's the end of the review. Y'all don't know how happy I am that chapter 7 went by this quickly. It may have drug on for y'all, but it went a lot quicker than I expected. Anyway, subscribe by clicking the button down below. Give me a thumbs up if you enjoyed this video. It's a free way for you to show your support for my channel. As always, thank you so much for watching this video on the North Carolina real estate exam prep. This was chapter 7. Up next, we have agency contracts, which we get into the fun of commissions and how much money you'll make. Grab the 10% off link down in the description below for your continuing education, post-education, and pre-licensing classes for new signups. And I'll see you on the next one.